Bruce Lee's fist is already resting against the old man's chest when the room understands what it's looking at. Not a strike. Contact. Knuckles flat against gray cotton. 1 inch of empty air behind them. The whole arm coiled like a spring nobody has released yet. Somewhere behind Bruce, a folding chair sits exactly where a nervous volunteer dragged it out and offered it. And the old man looked at that chair the way you look at an insult. He didn't sit. He's 68 years old, and he is still standing on both feet, hands loose, staring at a 27-year-old in a black t-shirt like he's waiting for the weather to do something. 200 people in a rent-a-hall in Long Beach are not breathing. Somebody's folding chair creaks. Nobody looks over. The old man nods once. Small, almost private, like he's agreeing with something only he can hear. Bruce's fist travels 1 inch. And here's the part that took the room 20 years to stop arguing about. The old man barely moves. His feet don't slide. His head doesn't snap back. He rocks, maybe 2 inches at the hips, the way a tree rocks in wind that isn't quite strong enough to bother it. And then he's standing exactly where he was standing before, looking at Bruce Lee with an expression nobody in that hall could read. Somebody near the back says, loud enough to carry, "He missed." He did not miss. Stay with me, because this is the story where being right and being believed turn out to be two completely different things, and the gap between them is where everything interesting happens. Here's the version they tell in the back rooms of old dojos, the one that refuses to die, the one that's outlived 3 of the men who were standing in that hall that night. I've heard 4 versions of what the old man said to Bruce before he ever stepped up. I've heard 6 versions of what happened afterward. I can't swear to any single detail of it. What I can tell you is that every version, everyone, starts with a chair nobody would sit in and ends with Bruce Lee losing the one trick nobody else on earth could do. Let me take you back to how it started, because the old man didn't walk into that hall to test a 27-year-old showman. He walked in 7 months earlier looking for something he'd lost with his own hands, and the punch was just where the search happened to lead him. 1964. A converted Union Hall a few blocks off the water in Long Beach. Folding chairs on a concrete floor. A banner that says International Karate Championships in letters that don't quite line up. Bruce Lee is not famous yet. He is a man with a small school in Oakland, a following of maybe 40 serious students, and a habit of ending arguments about the effectiveness of his art with a demonstration instead of a debate. Tonight, the demonstration is the 1-inch punch, a strike that starts from a fist already touching the target, travels 1 inch, and puts a full-grown man on his back into a chair set up specifically to catch him. It works every time he's done it. It has worked in front of skeptics before. Men twice his size have gone down off that inch of movement, and every time it happens, somebody in the crowd laughs the wrong kind of laugh, disbelieving, then unsettled, then quiet. The old man is standing near the side exit when the demonstration starts, arms folded, a scar running pale across the back of his right hand that nobody in that room is close enough to notice yet. He has been in Long Beach for 4 days. Nobody invited him. He is not on any list of instructors, not affiliated with any of the schools represented in the room, and when Bruce asks, as he always does, for a volunteer, the old man is already walking forward before anyone else has raised a hand. The room smells like 100 other rented halls from that era. Floor wax, cigarette smoke drifting in from the lobby, the particular mustiness of folding chairs stacked all year in a back closet and drag out twice a summer for events exactly like this one. Somebody set up a card table near the stage with a coffee, earned nobody's refilled since 6 o'clock, and a hand-lettered sign taped to the wall lists the evening's demonstrations in a marker that's already starting to smear from the humidity coming off the water a few blocks away. This is 1964 California karate culture in its most literal form. Dozens of small, fiercely proud schools, each one certain its particular lineage is the serious one, gathering twice a year in halls like this to watch each other's best students perform, argue about styles in the parking lot afterward, and occasionally when somebody's ego gets ahead of their manners. Settled disagreements, the way disagreements got settled in rooms like this. By 1964, Bruce has given some version of this demonstration close to a dozen times, and he has refined it the way a man refines anything he's proud of. He tells the room the punch travels 1 inch. He tells them it will put a man his own size on the ground. He says this the same way every time, flat, almost bored, because he has learned that confidence delivered quietly lands harder than confidence shouted. What he does not say, what nobody in that room would think to ask, is who usually volunteers. It's students, mostly, his own or a friendly instructor's, somebody who trusts him, somebody whose body already knows how to receive force without fighting it on the way in. A cooperative spine goes over easy. Bruce knows this the way a locksmith knows which pins are soft. It has never once occurred to anyone watching to wonder whether the demonstration would look the same against a body that didn't want to move. Tonight it's about to. Somewhere around 40 people are close enough to actually hear what gets said between the two of them, and every one of those 40, asked separately over the following decades, gives you a slightly different account of exactly how many words passed between them before the first punch, which tells you something about how memory works around a moment everybody instantly understands is going to matter long before it's finished happening. The old man reaches the front of the room and stops 2 feet from Bruce, close enough that the younger man has to look up slightly to meet his eyes, and for a moment neither of them says anything at all. Somebody near the back, a big man in a stiff white GI who will matter later, though nobody knows that yet, leans over to his neighbor and says, "Lo, that's not one of the students." He's right. The old man has never studied with Bruce Lee, has never met him, and has spent the last 30 years of his life doing something that has nothing to do with volunteering for demonstrations in rented halls. "You've done this on a lot of grateful men," the old man says. "Not loud. Loud enough. Do it on me." Somebody laughs, the wrong kind of laugh, the kind that comes out before the room decides whether it's actually funny. Bruce doesn't laugh. He studies the old man's stance for 3 full seconds, feet, weight, the set of the shoulders, and what he sees is a man who has spent decades learning how not to be moved by force, which is a completely different skill from learning how to hit. "Sit in the chair," Bruce says and gestures at it. "No," the old man says. "Hit me standing or don't hit me at all." And that's the moment, right there, the volunteer refusing the chair, where 200 people in a rented hall stop talking about anything else, and a story starts that neither man in that room is going to walk away from clean. Here's what gets me about it. Bruce could have said no. He could have smiled, called the old man a good sport, and picked one of his own students instead, the way he had 11 times before, the way that had never once failed to draw a gasp. Nobody would have blamed him. Almost nobody in that hall would have even noticed the substitution. He didn't, and I think the reason he didn't tells you more about him than the punch does. Set up first, because this is a story about mechanics as much as it's a story about men. Bruce settles into a stance barely wider than standing. Feet a shoulder apart, rear heel raised a fraction, weight low and forward, his right fist already touching the old man's chest. No wind-up, no chamber, nothing for the eye to read as a warning. The old man squares up across from him, both feet flat on the concrete. Weight sunk through his hips the way a man stands when he has spent half a lifetime learning that the ground is the only thing that will not eventually betray him. Technique. The fist doesn't travel far. An inch, maybe less. What moves is everything behind it. Hip snapping through first, shoulder trailing a half beat later. The whole chain arriving at the knuckles in a sequence, so fast the eye reads it as simultaneous when it isn't. There's no backswing to see coming. No arc. Nothing the old man's decades of reading punches has trained him to anticipate, because there is functionally nothing to anticipate. The blow is already touching him before it starts. Biomechanics, and I'll keep this short because I know a lecture when I'm about to give one. A conventional punch spends its energy accelerating over distance, a foot, 2 feet, sometimes more, and a trained body reads that distance and adjusts, absorbs, rolls with it. This punch has no distance to read. The power comes from rotational sequencing, not a runway. Hips, torso, shoulder, arm fired in relay in under a fifth of a second, so that by the time a nervous system registers contact has occurred, the force has already been delivered and is looking for somewhere to go. Reaction. And this is where the story splits into two versions, because what happens next depends entirely on whose account you believe. In one version, the old man goes down exactly like everyone else has gone down, flat onto his back, the chair he refused to sit in sliding 2 feet across the concrete from the impact, students in the front row actually flinching backward like the air itself had moved. In the version I trust more, because 6 separate witnesses independently describe the same detail years apart without ever comparing notes, the old man doesn't go down at all. He rocks, 2 inches at the hips, maybe 3, the way a heavy door rocks on old hinges sound resistance, and then it simply stops rocking and hangs there. His feet never leave the floor. His weight never fully breaks. When emotion settles, he's standing exactly where he was standing 10 seconds earlier, staring at Bruce Lee with an expression that isn't pain and isn't triumph and isn't anything the room has a word ready for. Observation, and here's where the witnesses agree again, whatever they disagree about on the rest of it. One of them, a man who trained judo for 11 years by the time that night happened, put it to me this way, decades later, in a phone call I'll never be able to verify and have no reason to doubt. I've watched that punch put down bigger men than him. I watched it work on men half his age. That night, it should have worked. And it looked like it did work, right up until it didn't, and none of us could explain the difference. Somebody in the crowd says it again, louder this time. He missed. He must have missed. He did not miss. Bruce Lee knows exactly how hard he hit, and standing there with his fist an inch from where it started, watching a 68-year-old man refuse to fall down, he understands something the rest of the room hasn't caught up to yet. This is how it began. For seconds of silence, nobody in that hall moves. Then the room exhales all at once into noise, into arguing, into 40 separate conversations about what everyone just watched happen to a man none of them had seen before that night. And by the time anybody thinks to ask him a question, the old man has already picked his jacket up off a folding chair by the door and walked out into the parking lot without a word to anyone. The big man in the stiff white GI, the one who'd leaned over earlier to say that's not one of the students, is the loudest voice in the room within about 90 seconds, and he stays the loudest voice for years afterward. He runs a moderately successful school 2 towns over, has never lost a demonstration match in his own building, and does not care for the idea that a stranger just stood there and ate Bruce Lee's signature strike like it was nothing. He pulled it, the big man tells anyone who'll listen, before the hall has even finished emptying out. You don't do that to a man twice your age you don't know. He held back. It's a generous read, and it's also, in its own way, an insult dressed up as one. Because if Bruce held back out of caution, then the demonstration proved nothing at all, and the big man knows exactly how that version sounds compared to the one where an unknown 68-year-old simply refused to fall down. He tells his version of that night in his own school for years afterward, refining it the way people refine stories that flatter something they need to believe, and by the time it circulates back around to Bruce secondhand, months later, it's grown a detail that never happened at all, that Bruce apparently apologized to the old man afterward for pulling the strike. Bruce never apologized to anyone that night. He didn't say a single word to the old man before he left. But that's how these things work, And it's worth sitting with for a second, because it's the first small brick in a wall that eventually becomes a real problem. A story doesn't need to be true to start doing damage. It just needs somebody with a room full of students and a wounded sense of certainty to keep repeating it. Bruce doesn't go after him. He tells people afterward that he let it go because there was nothing to chase. A stranger, in and out, gone before the question started. That's the version he gave in interviews for years, and it isn't exactly a lie. It just isn't the whole shape of it. The whole shape of it is that Bruce Lee went home that night and could not stop replaying 10 seconds of his own life, because for the first time since he'd started performing that punch in front of strangers, he wasn't entirely sure what he'd just seen either. 3 hours later, alone in the room he used for training above the storefront, he does the thing you do when you don't trust the last version of events. He tries to recreate it. On a heavy bag. On a student who owes him a favor and agrees to stand there and take it. On himself, in front of a mirror, watching his own hip rotation like it might confess something. The punch works. It always works. It puts the bag swinging, puts the student back a step, does everything the physics promises it should do. It is only on a stranger standing his ground, refusing a chair, that it apparently doesn't. And Bruce Lee, 27 years old and already more famous for certainty than he has any right to be at that age, spends that whole night turning over a question he does not like the shape of. What if the trick has only ever worked because everyone he's ever done it on wanted it to? 6 inches. That's roughly how much closer that question gets to the center of this story than the punch itself ever was. It's 1965 now. 11 months pass with no old man, no repeat visit, no explanation. And Bruce, to his credit, does something most 28-year-olds with a reputation to protect would not bother doing. He keeps a private list. Every demonstration after that night, in every city, he watches the volunteers' feet before he watches anything else, checking without ever admitting out loud what he's checking for. Then the old man reappears, in Oakland this time, standing at the back of a much smaller room during a regular Tuesday class, watching Bruce correct a teenager's stance with more patience than anyone in that class has ever seen from him. He doesn't challenge anybody. He doesn't say a word until the class ends and the room empties out. And when he finally speaks, it isn't about the punch at all. "You favor your right hand for balance work too," the old man says, "even standing still. Watch it sometime." Bruce watches it. He's right. What the old man doesn't explain that night, what it takes another 2 months of these quiet, unannounced visits for Bruce to piece together, mostly from things the old man doesn't say rather than things he does, is why a stranger with no school, no lineage anyone in the local community recognizes, and a scar across the back of one hand that he keeps out of sight more carefully than seems natural, has decided to spend his retirement watching a 28-year-old teach beginners. In exchange for nothing anyone ever asked him to give, the old man starts correcting small things. Not about striking, never about striking, but about balance, about how a body holds weight when it isn't moving, the kind of structural knowledge that 30 years of compensating for a ruined hand had made him unusually precise about. He shows Bruce how to root a stance, so a push from an unexpected angle can't easily topple it. He shows him how to read, in another person's shoulders, the half second before they commit their weight to a strike. None of it is flashy. All of it, Bruce absorbs like a man taking notes he doesn't yet know he's going to need. It's a strange, lopsided trade at first glance. A famous young instructor's growing reputation for speed and power, quietly being reinforced by an old man's decades of learning how not to be moved. But it's the exact shape of trade this whole story eventually turns out to be about, long before either of them has the language to call it that. Take a step back with me for a second, because the answer to that question is the whole engine of everything that happens next, and it has nothing to do with proving Bruce Lee wrong. 31 years earlier, On a dock in a city, the old man has never once named to anyone who's told me this story. A length of chain caught his right hand between a winch drum and a steel post, and by the time it was over, for bones in that hand had been crushed badly enough that a doctor at the time told him, flatly, that he would never again make a proper fist. He was 37. He had spent every year since he was 9 years old building a body around the idea that his hands were his primary tool for meeting the world. And in the space of maybe 4 seconds, that tool was taken away from him by a piece of industrial equipment that didn't know or care what it had just ended. He learned to compensate. Grip work with the left hand, structure and leverage instead of striking. Decades spent quietly becoming exceptional at absorbing force rather than generating it, which is precisely the skill that let him stand there in Long Beach and take a blow from Bruce Lee without going down. But something had been closed off inside him the day that Chain caught his hand, a door he'd assumed for 30 years would simply stay shut for the rest of his life. And then he heard, secondhand, through exactly the kind of overlapping small world coincidence that keeps martial arts communities gossiping for decades, about a young man in California who claimed he could generate a full-grown man's worth of force from 1 inch of travel, using rotation, not distance, using the body structure instead of the healthy fist's ability to accelerate over range. He didn't come to Long Beach to expose a showman. He came because if the claim was true, it might mean the door wasn't as shut as the doctor had told him it was. That's the myth doing its work. By the way, the version people tell each other is always the confrontation, always the challenge, because a duel is a better story than a 68-year-old man quietly chasing the last unclaimed hope of his own body. But I think the second version is the one that actually explains everything that happens over the following year, and I'd bet a great deal that it's closer to true. Look at it from his side for a second, because it changes the whole shape of what comes next. He starts showing up at the Oakland school too, sometimes 3 times a week, never as a student. He makes that clear early and often, but as something closer to an auditor. He watches. He asks questions that sound simple and aren't. How does the fist know when to stop tightening? What happens in the ankle a half second before the hip turns? Why does Bruce plan his weight the way he does instead of the way every other stylist in the room has been taught? Bruce, to his enormous credit, answers most of them honestly, partly because he genuinely doesn't know several of the answers yet himself and is curious to find out, and partly because, I think, some part of him understands that this scarred, silent 68-year-old is the only person who has ever stood in front of that punch and simply refused to fall down. And that refusal has earned him a kind of hearing nobody else in the room gets. Not every visit is tense. There's a Tuesday about 6 weeks into all this when a teenage student badly overbalances trying to copy Bruce's footwork and lands flat on his back in the middle of the floor. And the old man, who has said maybe 11 words total in the 2 hours he's been sitting there, laughs a short, surprised bark of a sound that apparently nobody in that school had heard from him before, and nobody quite believed the first time they heard it. Bruce, mid-correction, looks over at him and says, dry as anything, you're allowed to enjoy this, you know. The old man's answer, according to the one student who still told this story 40 years later with a grin on his face, I didn't say I wasn't. It's a small moment. It doesn't move the plot forward, and I include it anyway because I think it's easy to imagine this whole thing as 2 grim men circling a technical dispute, and it wasn't that, not most days. Somewhere in those months of quiet Tuesday and Thursday visits, something like an actual friendship built itself in the gaps between the harder conversations, which is, if you think about it, exactly why the harder conversation that was coming landed as hard as it did. 3 months in, on a slow Thursday with the school empty, except for the 2 of them, the old man finally says the thing he's clearly been carrying since Long Beach. You do that punch on students, he says. Your own. People who trust you. People whose bodies already know how to go where you send them. It works on anyone, Bruce says. It worked on me standing still, refusing to move, and it barely worked at all, the old man says. That should tell you something. And here's what gets me about this part of the story. Bruce doesn't argue. He doesn't get defensive, doesn't reach for the easy answer about age or experience or the old man being an unusual exception. He sits with it for a long moment, the way you sit with something you already privately suspected before somebody said it out loud for you. And then he says something that the old man apparently repeated to at least 2 other people over the following years, which is the only reason I know about it all. I've been performing a demonstration, Bruce says, not a test. That's the whole admission, 4 words shorter than the accusation that provoked it. And it's the moment this story stops being about a party trick and starts being about whether the man who spent 3 years building a reputation on that trick is willing to let somebody take it apart in front of him. Now, did Bruce Lee actually say that sentence in that room on that specific Thursday? I can't prove it. Nobody wrote it down at the time. It survives the way most of this survives secondhand, retold at dinners and in back rooms for 60 years, worn smooth in places and sharpened in others by every person who's passed it along. But every version of the story I've come across agrees that Bruce, faced with the old man's accusation, didn't defend the trick. He questioned it. And a man who questions his own signature move in private, 3 years before he's famous enough for anyone outside a handful of gyms to care, is a very specific kind of person, the kind who'd rather lose the trick than keep performing a lie about what it proves. The old man was right, in other words, not about Bruce being a fraud. He never once suggests that, and the story is careful, every time it's told, to make sure nobody walks away thinking Bruce Lee couldn't fight. He could, and did, more than once, against people who weren't cooperating at all. But the specific claim that the 1-inch punch as performed was closer to theater than to proof was true, and Bruce knew it was true before anyone made him say so out loud. That's the part of this story that doesn't fit neatly into a highlight reel, and it's also the part that makes everything after worth telling. The next morning, Bruce does something he's never bothered doing before. He asks a visiting judo instructor, a man with no reason to make this easy for him, no relationship to protect, no incentive to fall down politely, to stand still and take the punch exactly the way the old man took it in Long Beach. It doesn't go the way the demonstrations have gone for 3 years. The judoka rocks back, absorbs most of it through the hips, stays on his feet, and looks faintly disappointed, the way you look when somebody's famous trick turns out to be a trick. Bruce tries it twice more on 2 different men who owe him nothing, and gets some version of the same result both times. Real force, real movement, no collapse. It is, by any honest measure, still an impressive punch. It is not the specific miracle he's been selling. For about 6 weeks, Bruce Lee quietly stops performing it in public at all, which is the kind of detail that never makes it into the highlight version of this story, because nothing happened during those 6 weeks. No fight, no confrontation, just a 28-year-old alone in a room with a heavy bag and a growing, uncomfortable understanding that the thing he'd built part of his reputation on needed to be rebuilt from the floor up if it was going to mean what he'd been telling people it meant. A close training partner, one of the small circle of people Bruce actually confides in rather than performs for, asks him during those 6 weeks why he looks like a man who's misplaced something valuable. Bruce doesn't explain the whole story, the old man, the fence post that doesn't exist yet, none of it, but he says something the friend apparently remembers clearly enough to repeat decades later, that he'd built a reputation on being unbeatable in a very narrow, specific sense, and that narrow, specific sense had just turned out to be smaller than he'd let himself believe. So build a bigger one, the friend says, the way friends say the obvious thing that somehow nobody in the middle of a crisis can see for themselves. It's not profound advice. It isn't meant to be, but it's the kind of ordinary, almost throwaway sentence that ends up doing more work in somebody's life than any speech ever could, because Bruce apparently spends a good chunk of the following decade doing exactly that, building a reputation, and eventually an entire philosophy, on foundations wide enough that no single stranger refusing to fall down could ever threaten the whole structure again. Meanwhile, across town, the old man is doing something considerably stranger. He has never in his life tried to throw a fast strike. His entire style, 3 decades deep, is built around structure, leverage, absorbing another person's force and redirecting it. The discipline of a man who made peace long ago with the idea that his right hand would never again close the way it used to. But something about watching Bruce Lee question his own trick instead of defending it has put a thought in the old man's head that he can't seem to set back down. If force can be generated through rotation instead of distance, then maybe a hand that can't accelerate the old way could still deliver something, using leverage the way it's always used leverage, just aimed differently. He starts training alone, early mornings, in a small yard behind the building where he lives, working a strike that looks almost nothing like Bruce's, slower, rooted differently, built around hip drive and structural alignment rather than raw hand speed, compensating everywhere his ruined grip won't cooperate. For months, it produces nothing but a sore shoulder and a private, stubborn refusal to admit defeat to a project nobody else even knows he's attempting. 2 feet. That's roughly the gap between where the old man starts and where he eventually ends up. The distance, if you want to think of it that way, between a man who can't make a fist and whatever he becomes by the end of that year. It's the spring of 1966 now, and something is about to change that neither of them saw coming from where they started. The old man asks Bruce to come to the yard behind his building on a Sunday morning, and he doesn't explain why. And Bruce, who by this point has learned that the old man's silences usually mean something is coming, goes without asking twice. There's a single wooden post set into the ground, the kind you'd find holding up a fence, wrapped in rope and an old blanket where a body's meant to make contact. The old man positions himself in front of it, feet a shoulder apart, weight sunk low the exact way he stood in that hall in Long Beach 2 years earlier, and sets his damaged right hand an inch from the wrapped wood. Setup, no windup. He has deliberately and stubbornly refused to build one, because a wind-up is the thing his ruined grip can no longer control with any precision, and precision is the entire compensation he's spent a year building. Technique, the strike when it comes, is slower than Bruce's, visibly slower, a beat and a half where Bruce's version takes a fifth of a second, but the sequence is recognizably the same idea wearing older, more careful clothes. Hip first, structure locking through the spine a half second later, the damaged hand arriving last, almost as an afterthought, riding the wave the rest of the body already built rather than generating force on its own. Biomechanics. This is the part that should not work by every rule the old man's own doctor gave him 30 years earlier. A hand that cannot fully close should not be able to deliver a blow that means anything. What the old man has built instead is a strike that barely uses the hand as a striking tool at all. It uses it as a delivery point for force generated everywhere else in a body that has spent 3 decades becoming extraordinary at exactly this kind of structural transfer. Reaction, the post shudders. Doesn't crack, doesn't snap the rope. This is a fence post, not a man, and it was never going to go anywhere. But for anyone standing close enough, and Bruce is standing close enough, the shudder running through that wrapped wood is unmistakably the same signature of force that put grown men on the ground in Long Beach 2 years earlier. Slower to arrive. No question, once it lands, about what it is. Observation. Bruce doesn't say anything for a long moment, and when he finally does, it isn't praise and it isn't disbelief. It's quieter than either. How long? Bruce asks. A year, the old man says. On this. Longer, if you count everything before it. Here's what gets me about this part of the story, and I'll be honest, It's the part that took me the longest to believe, because it inverts the whole shape of what you expect from a tale like this. The old man hasn't just survived the demonstration that started this. He's rebuilt from a damaged hand and 30 stubborn years of a completely different discipline, a version of the exact thing that made Bruce Lee's punch a legend in the first place. Bruce Lee is no longer the only man on earth who can do this. And I want you to sit with how that actually lands, because it isn't triumphant. Not at first, not even for the old man. There's relief in it. Enormous, private relief. The kind that comes from a door you'd assumed was permanently shut, turning out to have one working hinge left. But there's something else in Bruce's face, standing in that yard watching a 68-year-old man do a rougher version of his signature move on a fence post, and every witness who's ever passed this part of the story along agrees on what that something else was. It wasn't jealousy exactly. It was the specific cold recognition that the thing he'd built part of his name on was no longer his alone, and that he had, in a way he hadn't fully accounted for, helped make that happen himself by being honest 3 months earlier instead of defensive. Maybe that's the price of telling the truth about your own trick. Maybe it always was. They stand in that yard for a long time afterward without saying much of anything, which is by this point in their friendship its own kind of conversation. Bruce eventually asks the only question that seems to matter, whether it hurts, throwing it that way, forcing a damaged hand to carry weight it was told 30 years earlier it would never carry again. Every time, the old man says, less than it used to. That's the whole answer, and it's the kind of answer that tells you everything if you're paying attention and nothing at all if you're not, because it isn't really about the hand, and both of them seem to understand that without needing to say so directly. Some things get less painful with repetition, not because the pain goes away, but because you build enough around it that it stops being the only thing you feel. On paper, this should have stayed a private thing between two men and a fence post. In practice, nothing involving a body of that many witnesses ever stays private for long. The old man has students of his own. Not many, for 5 men who trained under him years before the damaged hand, who'd stayed loyal out of respect rather than any expectation of new technique, and who noticed, the way students always notice, that their teacher had started coming to the yard early and leaving with fresh calluses on a hand everyone had assumed was permanently retired from that kind of work. They asked. He resisted answering for weeks, the same stubborn instinct that had kept him quiet about the whole project in the first place. Eventually, he showed 2 of them, just the basic shape of it. Hip drive, structural transfer, the compensation pattern he'd spent a year building around a hand that couldn't close the old way. He was careful. He walked them through it slowly, over months, the way he'd built it himself. His students were not as careful teaching the next layer down. Word travels fast in a small community built on reputation and rumor. And within a year, versions of the old man's punch were circulating through half a dozen schools that had no direct connection to him at all. Stripped of the structural foundation that took him a year to rebuild, taught as a party trick the way Bruce's own version had once been taught. A shortcut everyone wanted and almost nobody had the patience to earn properly. Add fear to the equation, because that's what happens next. 2 students at a school 3 towns over try to reproduce a strike they'd learned secondhand from someone who'd learned it secondhand from one of the old man's own, hyperextend their wrists badly enough to need a doctor. A third breaks 2 knuckles attempting to force hip drive through a hand that was never conditioned for the impact the way the old man's had been conditioned by 30 years of compensating for injury. None of it is the old man's fault, not directly. He never taught any of the men who got hurt, never met most of them, would have told them to slow down if anyone had asked him first. But that distinction doesn't survive the retelling. What survives is a simpler, uglier version. that a dangerous technique traced back, however many hands removed, to Bruce Lee's Long Beach demonstration was now putting people in casts. Take the third student, the one with the broken knuckles, because his version of it is the one that eventually reaches Bruce directly, through a mutual acquaintance who thought he ought to hear it firsthand, rather than through rumor. He's 19. He'd watched an older student demonstrate a rough version of the strike on a heavy bag at a barbecue, watched it land with a sound that impressed everybody standing around, and spent the following 2 weeks throwing it at the same bag every night after his regular job, trying to force his hand to generate what he'd seen without any of the structural groundwork the old man had spent a full year building underneath his own version. On the 15th night, something in the second and third knuckle of his right hand simply gives, and he sits down hard on the garage floor and doesn't get back up for a while. He doesn't blame the friend who showed him. He doesn't blame the old man, whose name he doesn't even know. When the mutual acquaintance eventually asks him who he thinks is responsible, he shrugs and says the name that everybody in that whole chain of secondhand teaching actually associates with the technique, the only name attached to it that ever appeared in a program or got mentioned in a magazine. Bruce Lee. That's the mechanism, right there in miniature, how a story travels for hands deep and still arrives back at the one name everyone recognizes, fair or not. And it's worth saying plainly, nobody in this chain did anything malicious. A friend showed a friend something impressive at a barbecue. That's most of how bad technique spreads in any discipline, in any decade, and it rarely announces itself as dangerous until somebody's already sitting on a garage floor finding out the hard way. By the 6th month of that year, the rumor has a shape sturdy enough that it stops being a rumor and starts being a problem. The kind of problem that shows up as letters from other instructors, as pointed questions at demonstrations, as a story that keeps arriving at Bruce's door slightly worse than the last time he heard it. 0. That's how many of those injured students Bruce Lee ever met in person. It didn't matter. His name was on the technique the way his signature is on a forgery nobody bothered to check. By early 1967, 3 separate instructors, men whose schools had nothing to do with the old man, nothing to do with Bruce, but plenty of investment in the reputation of the broader community, send word through the usual channels that they'd appreciate Bruce Lee stopping the 1-inch punch demonstration until the current confusion resolved itself. It's phrased politely. It is not, underneath the politeness, a request. One of the 3 is the big man in the white GI from that night in Long Beach, 3 years further into his career and still, by every account, telling his version of that evening to anyone who'll sit still for it. He isn't being cruel when he adds his name to that letter. He genuinely believes the injuries prove what he'd said from the start, that the demonstration was theater, that somebody eventually got hurt confirming it, and that the responsible thing is for Bruce to stop before it happens again. He's not wrong that people got hurt. He's just never once considered that his own retelling, repeated in his own school for 3 years, was one of the hands that carried the technique from a fence post in a private yard to a barbecue in a broken hand. When word of the injuries reaches the old man himself, and it does eventually the way everything in a small community eventually reaches everyone in it, he doesn't defend himself the way most people would by pointing out correctly that he never taught a single one of the men who got hurt. He calls his own 2 students to his yard, the same yard with the same wrapped fence post, and tells them, in front of each other, that whatever they've been showing to friends of friends stops immediately, in full, no partial version, no shortcuts, until he says otherwise. One of them argues, briefly, that he can't control what a friend's friend does with something he only demonstrated once at a barbecue. You can control whether you demonstrate it at all, the old man says. That's the only part that was ever yours to control. It's the same lesson, essentially, that Bruce gives that unnamed teenager years later without either of them apparently realizing they're teaching the identical idea from opposite ends of the same friendship. that a technique divorced from the discipline that built it isn't a gift, it's a loaded object handed to somebody without the instructions and the only responsible choice. Once you understand that, is to slow down and teach the instructions or not hand it over at all. Nobody in this story is a villain, and I think that's the part that makes it worth telling instead of just another highlight reel. A proud man protecting his reed of a night he witnessed. A curious old man rebuilding something he thought he'd lost forever. A 19-year-old at a barbecue, impressed by something he saw and eager to try it himself. Every single one of them did something completely understandable, and the sum of all those understandable choices put people in casts and cost a 29-year-old a year of his reputation. The big man delivers his portion of that message in person, which none of the other two instructors bothered doing, which tells you something about how personally he's taken all 3 years of this. He drives up to Oakland on a weeknight, waits until class lets out, and stands in the doorway of school with his arms crossed the exact way he stood at the back of that hall in Long Beach. "You know what people are saying?" he says. "I know what you're saying," Bruce answers. "I've heard the version with the apology in it. I never apologized to anyone that night." The big man doesn't flinch at being caught out. If anything, something in his face loosens slightly, like a man relieved to finally be having the real argument instead of the one everybody's been having about him behind his back. "Then tell me what actually happened," he says, "because from where I stood, you hit a 68-year-old man as hard as you've ever hit anyone in that hall, and he didn't go down. Either the punch is fake or something about that night doesn't add up, and either way, kids are showing up in emergency rooms trying to copy something nobody understands." Bruce doesn't correct him, doesn't explain the fence post, or the crushed hand, or a year of Tuesday and Thursday visits that have turned into something neither he nor the old man has a tidy word for. He just says, quietly, that he'll stop doing the demonstration, effective immediately, and that the big man is welcome to tell people whatever version of that decision makes the most sense to him. The big man looks almost disappointed not to get a fight out of the visit. He nods once, the same small private nod the old man gave before that first punch 2 years earlier, and drives back to his own school without another word. And when he finally does, he does the thing that's much harder for a proud 29-year-old to do than anyone watching from outside ever gives him credit for. He stops. Not the school, not the teaching, just the demonstration, the specific signature moment that had done more than anything else to build his early reputation as something beyond an ordinary instructor. The trick that got him into rooms full of strangers who'd never have given a 20-something Chinese instructor a hearing on reputation alone. He pulls it from every future appearance, tells organizers who ask that he's retiring the bid, and refuses every single time afterward to explain why in any detail beyond a shrug and a vague reference to wanting people to focus on substance instead of spectacle. From the doorway, it looked like something completely different than what it was. To almost everyone watching from outside, this reads as exactly one thing. Bruce Lee backed down. The showman got shown up, quietly, and pulled his signature trick before somebody could do it to him in public the way the old man had nearly done it in Long Beach. A few rival schools make sure that version gets told loudly, in the way rival schools always do when a competitor stumbles. And for close to a year, Bruce Lee's name carries a small, persistent asterisk it hadn't carried before. The guy who used to do that punch thing, until he couldn't anymore or wouldn't, depending who you ask. He never corrects the record. Not once, not to a single reporter, not even years later when people ask him directly in interviews about the missing demonstration. He lets the wrong version stand, absorbs a full year of a slightly diminished reputation, and doesn't say a word about the fence post, the old man's rebuilt hand, or the students' 3 towns over with their wrists in casts. Here's what gets me about that silence. It would have been so easy to explain. It's not that I can't do it. It's that it never proved what people think it proves, and now it's hurting people who don't understand it. That's a defensible, even admirable thing to say. He had it available to him the whole time, and he chose the version that made him look weaker instead. I don't think that was an accident, and I don't think it was pride either. I think, and this is where I'll admit I'm guessing, because nobody's ever confirmed it to me directly, that Bruce understood something the old man had shown him without ever saying it in so many words. That some truths are better carried quietly than defended loudly, and that a slightly damaged reputation is a small price for not making somebody else's story about you. Nearly a year after the demonstration went quiet, Bruce finally goes looking for the old man himself, which is notable mainly because he's the one who has always waited to be found, not the one who does the finding. He tracks him down through one of the 4 or 5 loyal students, drives out on a Sunday, and asks him, directly, no preamble, the closest thing to confrontation this whole friendship has ever produced, whether any of this had been an accident. The old man doesn't answer right away. He makes tea. He lets Bruce sit with the question long enough to start doubting he'd asked it seriously. Then he tells him the truth, or at least a version of the truth he chose to give, which is the only version any of us have access to now. He'd never intended to expose Bruce as a fraud, because he never believed Bruce was one, a 27-year-old who can rotate that much force through that little distance is not a fraud by any definition worth using. What he'd wanted from the moment he first heard the rumor about the punch and felt something old and shut down stir back to life in his chest was to find out whether the thing was a principle or a performance. If it was only ever a performance, a trick honed on cooperative bodies dependent on trust rather than physics, then it would die the moment somebody refused to cooperate, and that would be the end of the question. If it was a principle, it would survive contact with a stranger's full resistance. And more than that, it would be something that could be learned, rebuilt, carried by somebody else entirely, even as somebody with 4 crushed bones in his striking hand. He needed to know which one it was. Not for Bruce's sake. For his own. You could have just asked me, Bruce says. You'd have shown me the trick, the old man says. I needed to see the principle. Those aren't answered with words. I should tell you, before we go any further, that the version of this reveal I'm giving you is not the only one in circulation. I've heard a telling out of a school in Sacramento where the old man's confession comes not over tea, but standing in the rain outside Bruce's car, cut short after 2 sentences. I've heard one where it's Bruce who tracks the old man's motive down first, through the loyal students, and confronts him with it rather than the other way around. The tea, the 2 men sitting across from each other in an ordinary kitchen, working through a year of unspoken tension, one careful sentence at a time. That's the version I trust most, mostly because it's the one that keeps showing up independently from people who never trained anywhere near each other. But I want to be honest with you about the shape of this the way I've tried to be honest about all of it. Nobody recorded that conversation. Whatever was actually said in whatever room it was actually said in, we only have it because people who weren't there decided it was worth remembering and repeating for 60 years. Now, the students getting hurt, did the old man see that coming when he first let 2 of his own men in on what he'd rebuilt? I've heard people argue both sides of this for years, and honestly, I don't think it matters which is true. Either he foresaw the entire cascade, all the way down to strangers 3 towns over cracking knuckles trying to shortcut a year of work into an afternoon, which would make him a considerably more calculating man than the quiet, grieving figure most of this story shows you. Or he didn't foresee it at all, and simply watched afterward, as his private discovery did exactly what every unearned shortcut in this discipline eventually does to people who reach for it too fast. What he does say, when Bruce finally asks him that question directly, is this, that watching those injuries happen was the thing that convinced him Bruce had made the right call pulling the demonstration. Not because the students deserved better teachers, though they did. Because it proved in the ugliest possible way Exactly the point Bruce had privately conceded to him a year earlier in an empty school on a slow Thursday. That a trick performed without its underlying principle explained is a trick waiting to hurt somebody who doesn't know what they're actually attempting. That's the myth doing its work, in the end, on both of them. The story people tell is a duel. What it actually was the whole time was two men taking turns teaching each other the same uncomfortable lesson from opposite directions. 40 minutes into that Sunday conversation, over a second pot of tea neither of them finishes, the two of them arrive somewhere neither expected to land back in that parking lot 2 years earlier. Bruce asked the old man to show him the rebuilt version properly. Not the rough fence post draft from the year before, but whatever it had become since, refined by another year of quiet, obsessive repetition. The old man agrees, on one condition that tells you almost everything about the kind of man he turned out to be underneath the silence. That Bruce teach it back to him the way Bruce would teach a beginner, structural principle first, no shortcuts, nothing skipped, the exact opposite of how his own students had let it leak out into the world. They spend most of that spring doing exactly that, trading roles back and forth, teacher and student swapping seats, depending on the week, in a small yard behind a building that never once shows up in any photograph or program from that era, because neither man ever wanted it to. Bruce, by every account from the handful of people who caught glimpses of it, becomes considerably more careful after that spring about what he calls a demonstration versus what he calls a proof, a distinction he apparently insists on for the rest of his teaching life, correcting his own students when they blur it. The old man, for his part, finally lets two of his most trusted students learn the full version, properly, the same slow way he learned it, insisting every single time on structure before speed, principle before trick, because he has by then personally watched what happens when that order gets reversed. There's a story from a couple of years after all this, small, undocumented, the kind of thing that only survives because a handful of students who were in the room kept mentioning it to each other, about a teenager in Bruce's class asking, in front of everyone, why he'd stopped doing the famous one at demonstrations. Bruce doesn't answer right away. He has the kid stand in front of him, sets his own fist an inch from the kid's, chest the way he used to for paying crowds, and doesn't throw the punch at all. Instead, he asks the kid to try to knock him off balance from that same distance. No wind-up, no warning whenever he feels ready. The kid tries 3 times, fails 3 times, rocking back onto his heels each time without ever budging Bruce an inch. And by the 3rd failed attempt, he understands something about structure en route that no amount of watching a fast strike land on somebody else's chest would ever have taught him. Bruce tells him afterward that the version people paid to watch was never the interesting part. The interesting part is that a body positioned correctly can absorb force it never saw coming, or generate force in a fraction of the space it seems like it should need, and that both of those facts are the same principle, wearing 2 different faces. That's the lesson he apparently gave for the rest of his teaching life instead of the trick. Nobody paid $2 a head to watch it. It mattered more. Neither of them ever performs the punch again in front of a paying crowd. Bruce retires it from his public repertoire permanently, tells organizers for the rest of the decade that he has better demonstrations now, and never once, in any interview I've found, brings up the fence post, the crushed hand, or the 68-year-old man who refused a folding chair in Long Beach. But something else survives, quieter than the trick, and considerably more valuable. Bruce starts teaching a version of that structural principle. Hips before hands, rotation before reach, force generated through the body's own architecture instead of borrowed momentum. As a foundational idea rather than a party piece, folded eventually into the broader philosophy that would come to define everything he built afterward. Ask anyone who studied under him in the years that followed about economy of motion, about wasting nothing, about the idea that the smallest necessary movement beats the largest impressive one, and you're hearing, whether they know it or not, an echo of a fence post in a stranger's backyard. That's the part worth keeping, I think, more than the punch ever was. The old man dies a few years after that spring in the yard, quietly, the way he seemed to do most things, and the story goes that Bruce is one of maybe a dozen people at the service, standing at the back the way the old man himself once stood at the back of Hall in Long Beach, arms folded, saying nothing to anyone until it's over. Somebody who was there says Bruce stayed after the other mourners left, alone by the fence post. Because of course the service was held in that same yard, because where else would it have been, and stood there long enough that the family eventually had to come get him for the meal afterward. Nobody knows what he was thinking about, standing in front of a piece of wrapped wood that had absorbed 2 years of two men's arguments about honesty and craft and what a body owes the truth about itself. I like to imagine it was something close to gratitude, though I'll be the first to admit that's me filling a silence with the ending I want this story to have, rather than anything anyone actually heard him say. There's one more image people who tell this story like to end on, and I'll give it to you for what it's worth. Years later, long after the old man has passed, long after Bruce Lee has become the kind of name that doesn't need a last name attached to it, a folding chair turns up, so the story goes, in a corner of a storage room behind a school that no longer exists under any name anyone would recognize. Nobody remembers exactly why it was kept. Nobody can explain why. Of all the ordinary furniture that must have passed through that building over the decades, this particular chair survived. I can't verify a word of that detail, and I'll say so plainly rather than let it sit there dressed up as fact. But I like it anyway because it's a small, useless object that means everything if you already know the story and nothing at all if you don't, which might be the truest thing anyone's ever said about how legends actually work. So, how much of that actually happened? Honestly, I can't tell you with any certainty. This is a legend, dramatized and largely imagined. A story I tell, built loosely around a real demonstration Bruce Lee genuinely gave in Long Beach in 1964, and around a documented skepticism from traditional martial artists of the era that the one-inch punch was more spectacle than substance. The old man, the crushed hand, the fence post, the students in casts. None of that is a record of anything that happened. It's a story I'm telling you, not a file I dug up. But the part underneath it, a young man confident enough in his own reputation to admit, quietly, that his most famous trick had never been properly tested. The idea that being right about a technique and being honest about its limits are two different kinds of courage. That part, I'd bet my life, is real. Bruce Lee spent the rest of his career chasing exactly that distinction, in public and in private, long after any single demonstration stopped mattering. Some men become legends because of what they did. Bruce became one because of what he chose not to do, until the next legend. If this one got you, there are more legends where this came from. Subscribe, and I'll keep telling them.